So as I mentioned in the first section, probably the most important part of creating an authentic looking vintage image is the post-processing side. So we've done the great things to begin with. We've created our sets and we've dressed our models with vintage looking styling. So the final part is the post-processing. So we want to start with basically just going with some black and white images, or if we want to keep some color in it, just a very muted color. Then to create that very authentic look, we want to add some texture, and that's going to create some defects in the final image and make it look like it's quite an old image. So I've picked out 3 images from the workshop day. These were all captured either side of the workshop, either before or after, because I didn't shoot a lot myself during the actual workshop. So I've got a first image here of Lorelei with her lamps. That was an image that she really wanted to capture. And I did a few test shots of the 2 girls together in lingerie just before the workshop started. And at the very end, I grabbed this implied nude of Ginger in the tub. So all I've done to the black and white images to begin with is to choose a black and white profile. And I haven't really done any other adjustments, otherwise it's pretty much straight out of camera. For the image of Ginger, I've just reduced the saturation down by -30, and I'm just using one of the standard Fuji profiles, the Astia profile. So we could do some changes to these images a bit more in Lightroom. So something we could do is add a sepia tone, and if we look over here in the presets, we've got some options there for sepia tone. But I like to have a little bit more control over my tone, so I'm going to do that in Photoshop rather than Lightroom. So let's start by just opening this image up in Photoshop. There we go. So there we've got our image. But I'm just going to jump back into Lightroom for a second. I've accumulated a heap of textures and vintage looking frames and wet plate style textures as well. So I really love using these wet plate textures. They give a very authentic sort of look. So I might, this one here might work quite well. So I'm going to open that one up into Photoshop as well. I'll edit the original, so I'm not going to save it again. So then I just want to drag this image across and drop it over the top. And just reposition that. Now see that it doesn't quite fit the format of my original image of Lorelei. Just drag this across so you guys can see it. So what I'm going to do now is, with that layer selected, I'm just going to transform the scale, just so that it matches. Now if I hold the Shift key down in Photoshop 2020, I can then adjust that in without keeping the original aspect ratio. So one way of applying a texture to your background image is by using blending modes, and soft light is one of those blending modes that is quite commonly used. But you can see as we add the soft light over this image, it pulls in some of the color tone, which is great. It looks pretty good actually, but we don't get to see a lot of that texture because we've got such a textured background. You can see a little bit up in this top corner and down the bottom here, but I want that texture to come through a lot stronger. So I'm going to keep that in normal. I'm going to pull the opacity back a little bit so we can see our bottom image coming through. And then I'm just going to start erasing back this top image so that Lorelei and the rest of the background image can come in. I don't want to use the eraser tool though. I want to create a mask. So by hitting this little button down here, that creates a layer mask. And then by choosing our paintbrush, because we've got a white layer mask, we want to choose black as our color. And then whatever we paint in is going to get rid of the background. So I'm using it at 26% opacity and 31% flow. I'm normally around about 20 roughly on each, 20-25. And I can just gradually start pulling back some of the image below. But what I really love about this texture frame is the edges, and that's what I want to keep. So I'm not going to take this all the way to the ends. I'm just going to do something like that, and I'm going to take the opacity back up to 100% so I can see what we're actually getting here now. Now you'll see we've got that warm tone of the textured image where it hasn't been erased back. Now we've also got the original black and white image coming through underneath. So I'm going to add my tone at the very end. So what I want to do is take all the saturation out of that original textured layer. So always make sure that you've got your mask selected when you are erasing back. Just flicking that on and off and you'll see what's happening there. Just going to take a little bit of that sort of fogginess off the edge, and I think that's getting pretty good. So keeping that at 100%. Now I can also make adjustments to the brightness of that image. So I'm just going to pull up my levels on that textured image and pull the blacks in a bit and pull the midtones down a bit, so it just makes a little bit more of a darker overall image, and that really shows those edge defects coming through, which look pretty cool. But we've pretty much erased all the texture out of the center area. So what I might do is add yet another texture. So I'm going to jump back into Lightroom and find an image that's just got some more plain texture to it. So one of these might be pretty good. It's a pretty heavy texture. Let's go with this one. So edit in Photoshop, edit original. And again, I just want to drag that over the top of Lorelei. Now this is a much smaller image, so I need to expand that out. So again, I'm going to edit the scale. And without holding the shift key down, I can change all sides equally. So I'm just going to make sure that fully covers. Click OK. Now let's see what soft light does. So in soft light now we can see that texture coming through as we zoom in here. See all those little spots, which I don't necessarily like too much on the skin tone. So I'm going to erase a little bit of that back as well now. So I'm going to create another layer mask. My paintbrush tool. And just on Lorelei's skin, I want to pull that back a little bit. And again, we can see as we're pulling that back, we are bringing more of the black and white image through. So again, just so I can see what's going on, I'm going to desaturate that texture layer there. So that's pretty good. It's looking quite nice actually. We've got a little bit of those defects and artifacts of that texture layer coming through. So I might just pull that back slightly, a little bit more. Just on the areas where it's really, really obvious. But I don't want to get rid of it completely. So around the face is an area that I want to get rid of. And I think that's looking pretty good. But I want to add some more tone a bit more warm tone to this image. So what I'm going to do is go down here and add a photo filter. The default is the warming filter 85, but we do have the LBA, which is a slightly different tone, and warming filter 81. We also have the sepia. Of course, we can change our density to these as well. So the sepia is quite nice. It's not an ugly yellow sepia. It's got a bit more of a chocolatey brown, which I really like. So I think around 40, maybe even 50%. 50 might be a bit strong. I'll just take it back down to 40. Drop that above the other layers so it's sitting on top. So what I really like is we've got some like textures, like it looks like there's a crack coming through on that light bulb. A bit more texture showing through there. If we look really closely, there's a lot of texture coming across the front. It's a little bit still on Lorelai's stomach, which is kind of good, those little spots, but on her face it's quite clean. Alright, that's saved. Let's close that. Let's go back to Lightroom. So now we can have a look at our original and our edited image. So when we do a side-by-side comparison, the textures and the edge defects are really coming through strong.